Okay, on behalf of Engineers Ireland GB region, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. We're delighted to have Louise Moriarty of Hawkins Brown Architects and the Construction Industry Cycling Commission presenting for us today. Louise is an architect, an engineer, and a cyclist. As an engineer, she's worked in the Netherlands, where she experienced a country famous for its cycling infrastructure. As a cyclist, Louise has spent 10 years racing in the international peloton with professional cycling teams and the Irish national team. And as an architect, she studied in Dublin and London, carrying out her design thesis on the topic of cycling in London. Subsequently, she's worked as an urban designer on sustainable transport and the design of cycling infrastructure, and is now an architect with Hawkins Brown. As a member of the Construction Industry Cycling Commission, she spreads her love of cycling through the Design for Cycling CPD, which she is about to present to us now. Any questions can be posted in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get through as many of them as we possibly can at the end. So without further ado, over to you, Louise.
Hello, as Kieran said, I come from a background in cycling, in racing, but also having lived in countries with really good cycle infrastructure, I would really promote cycling for utility, like commuting to work. And in my first jobs after graduating, I worked in urban design, including design for cycling. So when I was asked to join the Construction Industry Cycling Commission, all of these things kind of resonated for me. So the Construction Industry Cycling Commission has a remit to, broadly speaking, create safer environments for walking and cycling, but particularly focused on safety around HGVs. So this is our 10-point manifesto, and number 7 relates to these CPDs. So it was a commitment that for design professionals to be better trained in the design and planning of safer environments for vulnerable road users. And so as part of that, I do these CPDs to local authorities, architecture practices, and now to Engineers Ireland. I'm honoured to be asked. But the whole basis starts with, it was set up in 2013 in response to the death of Francis Golding, who was a planning consultant in a cycling accident. And our industry is brilliant for people cycling and for active travel, but I suppose unfortunately associated with that, we've also lost quite a few people to cycling injuries. And the Commission would like to try to change that. And they're particularly focused on safety around HGVs, and there are a lot of HGVs in the construction industry, so it's quite relevant. But the startling statistic is that only 3.5% of traffic is made up of HGVs, but 57% of cycling fatalities are caused by HGVs. So if you can improve safety around HGVs, you stand to vastly improve the number of fatalities on the roads. But let's go back to basics. Why design for cycling? I will apologize in advance. This is particularly, I normally give this CPD to architecture practices in London. So it might be a little bit London centric, but that's not to say that you shouldn't give me all of your opinions on other areas of the UK and Ireland. So cycling is booming in the UK, and there have been a number of reasons for this. So there was the introduction of the Cycle to Work scheme. There was the unfortunate 7/11 bombings in London, where a lot of people went and bought bikes because they were scared to go in public transport. There's been the success of the GB cycling team. And now, more recently, COVID, people are being advised not to use public transport. And so the natural safe means is to walk or cycle, to be outdoors. And in London, we've seen some temporary cycle lanes put in, which are great. And equally in Manchester, Andy Burnham and Chris Boardman have instigated a fantastic regime for creating the B lines. Construction started in January of this year, creating a whole network of cycle infrastructure for Manchester. So it's become a form of mass transport, and it needs to start being treated as such. It's also the most efficient form of transport. So this graphic translates the amount of energy required to travel 5 kilometers by different transport modes and translate it into eggs. So cycling is the most efficient. And the reason for this is once you get some momentum going, the wheels allow you to carry that momentum until you hit an obstacle like a hill or something. Cycling's healthy. It's been proven that people who commute to work have lower levels of absenteeism, for example, so that's good for the economy. And COVID has changed things a lot, but the UK is still not a cycling nation. So scenes like this are still commonplace. I think, so on the left-hand side, this is great. We've got some new bike lanes, but on the right-hand side, this is a common scene. And I think someone from the Netherlands would be quite shocked to see this, like why the little cyclists are sharing the road with HGVs, with buses. Nobody seems to know where they should be. And this is a situation which we need to increasingly avoid, I think, and go more towards the image on the left-hand side rather than the right. So we've looked at reasons why people do and don't cycle. This is coming from a TfL study. So lots of things, obviously, as design professionals, we can't control. We might like to, but we can't control the weather. But particularly the things we can control are, in the case of engineers, the road environment and how the road section is divided up between different road users. And that will help a lot in number 3 here, which is too dangerous, to try to make it safer. Infrastructure has a big part to play in making it safer. It's both behavior and infrastructure, but people also, they go hand in hand. People need to know how to use the infrastructure, but ideally the infrastructure needs to be there. We've also looked at why people cycle in Copenhagen, and it's quite interesting because only 1% of people cycle because it's good for the environment. The majority of people cycle because it's the easiest, fastest, most convenient way to get from place to place. And when you look at a journey in Copenhagen, you can start to see why. So this journey is a trip by car across the city centre, which takes 37 minutes from the start point to the destination. But if you take the same trip by bike, it only takes 13 minutes. So that's a big difference. It's a much easier, quicker route by cycling. And that's what will attract people to cycling. And in that, cities have an advantage over more rural towns where it is actually quicker to cycle. So for example, in London, typically a bike will outpace a car through London traffic and through the London narrow roads. So we can pick up on this and use it in designing. But again, I think there's a bit of an attitude problem in Ireland and in the UK with cyclists. There seems to be a lot of conflict between drivers and cyclists. Certainly in the Netherlands, this is not how cyclists are perceived, as like, they don't wear high vis, they don't wear helmets, they wear their normal clothes, especially cycling to work. Even people who race in the Netherlands will have just a regular bike for going to work. And in the Netherlands, also, it's not gender specific. So actually more women cycle than men in the Netherlands. And I think all of that perception is a bit unfair, because actually, in reality, cycling is beneficial to society. This graphic demonstrates that in terms of money. And it's not just down to the fact that cycling doesn't pollute on the roads. It's also to do with the wear and tear on roads. Like cycling obviously breaks roads up a lot less than vehicles do. And also to do with health outcomes. So people who are fit go to hospital less, they cost the economy less in that way. People who are sedentary are much more prone to various diseases such as heart disease and cost the economy in the round more. And I'm also a big believer in inclusivity. So although I race, I have a normal bike for going to work. When I lived in Holland, I had a big Dutch bike with a basket, which was great. And I think we need to design the infrastructure for all of these people. They say if you design for a child, you design for everyone. So if a parent would feel happy allowing their child to cycle on a cycle lane, then I think you can feel like you've designed a good piece of cycle infrastructure. And also that cyclists might travel at different speeds. So you must allow for the fact that a faster cyclist might need to overtake a slower cyclist in thinking about how to design. And I think is very encouraging over the past 50 years or so. So in the 20th century, when people being able to own a private car was a new thing, it was all about, traffic planners were all about how many cars can we move down the street? How can we move it as much as possible? And they actually pushed aside cycling, and they pushed aside walking, and they discriminated a bit against cyclists. And not only in the UK and Ireland and in America, but also in the Netherlands. It's just that in the Netherlands, the people protested against it and changed it. And now I think you're seeing all over the world a more nuanced view of this question. And it's about how many people can we move down the street? And it might be more efficient to move people using a tram system and cycling and walking than it is to have the whole road given over to cars. But looking again at how you convince those who aren't cycling to cycle. So there's a certain percentage, 5% here in this survey, who are essentially fearless and they don't need cycle infrastructure. They'll go anyway. They don't really mind. There's also a percentage here, 28%, who will never cycle. And that might be to do with health reasons. It might be they just don't like cycling. They don't like cyclists, whatever the reason. It's unlikely that you will convince them to cycle. But then there's this big section in the middle, 60%, who are described as enthused but concerned. And those people, if you provided safe infrastructure, they would be much more likely to be encouraged to cycle. So there's quite a large proportion of people who might be swayed one way or the other. But those people who are worried, the worry, it's not unfounded. So this study was commissioned from a university by the Construction Industry Cycling Commission. And they looked at the most dangerous situations for a cyclist. So top of it is where another vehicle turns right across the path of a cyclist. So the cyclist thinks they have right of way, and maybe they do have right of way, and they're going straight on and they don't see a car swerving around to the right. Or you're cycling along on the inside of a lane of traffic. So actually you're coming up inside a vehicle, and the vehicle turning right doesn't see the cyclist until he emerges from behind the vehicle, the vehicle going in the same direction as a cyclist, and then a collision occurs. So that's one to watch out for. Another is when vehicles open doors without looking behind. So there's currently under consultation a new set of rules, the Highway Code, and they're going to instigate the Dutch Reach, where you're encouraged to, or by law, if you're going to open your door on the roadside, you need to use your opposite hand, which forces you to look over your shoulder and see anything that might be coming. And then number 3, this really scares me. This one is, you might be cycling along and a HGV comes up outside you, or you come up inside a HGV and the driver of the vehicle doesn't see you. And especially if there's a pedestrian barrier along the edge of the pavement, cyclists in that situation have been crushed. So all of these things are things that need to be considered when you're designing cycling, and also when you are cycling, just the particular situations where you need to be a bit more careful. So what can we as design professionals do? So I think broadly there are 5 things that we can do. Now, given this talk is usually given to architects, so I'll try to adapt it a little bit to engineers, but it's good also for each point of view to understand the other. So I think the first thing is design awareness. So I'll give some basic principles of street design. I'll run through quickly some guidance for designing cycling in. 3 and 4 are quite similar, and these are to do with the CLOCS standards, which are a set of standards developed by TfL, which govern how construction vehicles basically behave around site. But the fundamental principle of it is normally the contractor is responsible for health and safety on site, on the building site. But the CLOCS standards puts the onus of responsibility on the contractor also for vehicles driving to and from the site. And that includes things like driver tiredness, like you can't overschedule a driver to the point where he's too tired and then he might make mistakes and an accident is caused. And the final is design ambition. So I think sometimes with talk about health and safety, it becomes sort of, maybe too cautious. And people forget that if you have a really high design quality and it allows people to feel comfortable and relaxed, actually that makes it safer, but in a much more intuitive way. So at the end, I'll give some nice examples of cycling infrastructure. So the first one here is street design. So you may be familiar with this piece of guidance, which is developed by Lucy Saunders, but is now enshrined in policy. So it's compulsory when you're designing an urban space. And it's a toolkit. So it has these range of items upon which you rate your street or urban space, such as clean air, easy to cross, places to stop, people feel safe. And if you score highly on all of those, you're likely to have created a really good street or public space. So for example, you would slow vehicular traffic and make it easy to cross. And particularly you would make it easy to cross at the point of desire. So here on the entrance to the station. Activity at street level. So typically this is spoken about in terms of active frontage in urban design terms. And active frontage normally means retail or shops. But it can be something simple as detail in the environment. So there's a famous urban designer called Jan Gehl who worked a lot in Copenhagen. And he did studies about the speed at which people travel by different transport modes relative to the amount of detail in their environment. So for example, for drivers, that would be billboards. So if there were more billboards, drivers tended to drive more slowly because there was more to take in. If you were walking, that could be as simple as the difference between a blank concrete facade and a nice brick facade. So as there's more detail in the environment, you tend to become more engaged in it, and then you walk more slowly. And that all goes to help activity at street level and interest and people being aware of what's happening. And in this kind of situation, more people choose to walk or cycle and they tend to feel safe and relaxed, which makes for a good environment. These are 5 key principles to keep in mind when designing for cycling. So routes should be safe, direct, comfortable, coherent, and ideally also attractive. So here I have a few examples of what to do and what not to do. You may already be familiar with this type of thing and you may have your own opinions, and please feel free to voice those. So there's quite a debate over whether cycle lanes should be 2-way or they should be 1-way and in line with the traffic, so either side of the road. Generally, I would prefer that they are in line with the traffic, so either side of the road. But in this situation, this is a really good example of a cycle lane because it has very good separation between the different modes. So you can see that white fan is highly unlikely to impede upon the cyclist because there's a curb stopping his wheels going over into the cycle lane. But equally, between the pavement and the cycleway, there's this little chamfered curve, which is very forgiving. So if as a cyclist, I'm chatting and I'm not paying so much attention and my wheel goes actually towards the pavement, I realize quite quickly and I can correct it very easily without actually impinging upon or endangering pedestrians. It's also generous enough that people can overtake and generous enough that people can ride side by side and chat, which I think is something that gets forgotten in designing infrastructure, that cycling is really sociable. Unlike 2 cars driving beside each other, 2 cyclists cycling beside each other often have, they speak to each other. You can go along with a friend, and it's enshrined in Dutch policy that you should be able to do that. All the kids go to school together in a group, chatting, they pick up their friends along the way. It's part of their social life. And this is a nice example where these two people can do that. This is something to avoid. So I think here, particularly during the temporary works, it would be better not to have a cycle lane, because if I follow the rules as a cyclist and I cycle on the cycle lane, I stand to crash into a barrier, I stand to have a taxi cut across my path from the left, or I stand to be crushed by a bus if he comes up on the right because I have to move into their lane. They should also be direct. So there are a number of strategies for how you can make routes more direct for cycling rather than for driving, which this is a bit similar to that example from Copenhagen. It can be as simple as bollards, and those bollards can move up and down to allow emergency vehicles to pass through. Ideally continuous and logical, so that you're not stopping all the time to reroute. This is something to avoid. So here, as a cyclist, if I follow the rules, or like follow what the drivers will expect me to do, which is to be on the path on the cycle lane, I lose all my rights at this junction because the cars have right of way. So I've got to wait for them to pass. If I'm impatient and I try to go around them, I might bash into another cyclist coming in the opposite direction because I have to swerve around the car. And as a confident cyclist, what I would probably do in this situation is follow the red line. So I would come out onto the road where I have more rights, and I can go straight through this junction without having to stop. So a better solution in this situation would be to run the cycle lane right across that junction, maybe in a different color asphalt, or certainly with the lining, and push the stop line for the cars further back so that they have to stop for the cyclists. Journeys should be comfortable. So they should start and end with easily accessible, safe and protected facilities. The start and end points of journeys are particularly important for comfort. So for example, as architects, if we can build in showers and nice changing rooms and drying rooms, it's the difference between someone on a rainy day choosing to cycle or choosing not to cycle. Because if I can take a shower when I get to work, I can still look professional for my meeting. Whereas if there's no facility like that, I might take public transport instead. Another thing about safety is the point I made at the start, is that designing for comfort can improve safety, because when you feel more comfortable and relaxed, you tend to be more aware and better able to respond to things that happen. And there are a number of ways of doing this. So you've probably heard in Copenhagen of the green wave, which is a system along one of the main thoroughfares in Copenhagen, where if you travel at the typical speed of a cyclist, which I think is set at about 16 kilometers per hour, you will get green lights the whole way along this road. So all of the signaling is adapted to suit the pace of cycling rather than the pace of car drivers. And then other things that we're seeing in London is that advanced stop lines, low-level traffic lights, and cycle early release. These all serve to allow the cyclist to be in front of the cars at traffic lights, so they're very visible, and then also to move off before vehicles move off, so that the cyclists get a chance to start and not impede the cars before cars or other vehicles get going. And then this one is also a nice one, which I think would be helpful in London in particular, to encourage cyclists to stop at zebra crossings. So the pedestrians in London are some of the most nervous I've ever seen. They're quite tentative in stepping out onto zebra crossings, and I feel like that's because their experience has told them that not all vehicles stop for them. Routes should be coherent, easy to understand and easy to navigate, and you can do that using visual hints. So the quiet ways in London aim to do this half successfully. But the key point is, if it's quite difficult to navigate, I have to keep stopping to look at my phone to figure out where I should go. And at some point, I'm going to start being late for my meeting or late for work, and I'll get impatient. And the likelihood then is I'll just take a main route, a main road, which makes it less pleasant for me and also more dangerous for everyone. And ideally, cycle infrastructure should be attractive. So this goes back to Lucy Saunders' streets, healthy streets, and also to the fact that the more attractive a place is typically the more relaxed you feel and the safer it becomes. So you can imagine if you were cycling along here, you'd probably cycle a little bit slower because the environs are quite interesting. You go, oh, do I know anyone at the cafe? Will I stop for a coffee? And also you'll expect, because the level of the paving is at the same level as the asphalt, you might expect that people will walk across your route. So you'll be watching out for that and being a bit more slow and cautious, as well as the fact that it's just enjoyable. So where I used to live, I could detour onto a really nice cycle route that was completely off-road and among trees. And although that was a slightly longer route for me to take, I would take that every day because it gave me 1 kilometre or 2 kilometres of really nice cycling on my way home. So people will detour slightly to use attractive infrastructure. So the next topic is to try to design cycling in. So I'm not sure of all of your positions, but if you're working in transport planning or civil engineering, you'll often come in contact with clients and you might have the opportunity to influence them. So clients will come in various forms. They might be quite informed and really enthusiastic about cycle infrastructure. Like Hawkins Brown at the moment have 2 clients that have requested cycle ramps in their buildings, which is great. You'll have enthusiastic ones who really want to do nice cycle parking, or in their development provide well for cyclists in a master plan. And then you'll also have uninformed clients or even resistant clients. So for architects, that's people who are questioning, why do I need to have so many Sheffield stands in here? Nobody's going to use them. And so the guidance kind of, and also BREEAM gives us a way to kind of encourage and also inform the client of their responsibilities as to cycle infrastructure. So ideally you want to get that into the brief early on, and that allows you to protect it from value engineering later. And also you can write the clock standards into tender documentation. And cycling can be encouraged as part of a Section 106 agreement as well. This is a brief overview of some guidance. It's particularly related to London, but there is really good guidance also from Manchester, to my knowledge, and in Scotland, and I'm sure in Ireland it's now developing also. The highway code is currently a few things are currently in flux due to COVID. So we've had the Prime Minister's strategy, we've had street-based space for London, and the highway code review, which is still under consultation. So you still can respond up until October 27th. And then design manual for roads and bridges and interim advice notes. So overall quantities for us, for architects, for cycle parking usually come from the London plan. Then gear change was the Prime Minister's recent strategy to encourage walking and cycling. Streetscape has come from Sadiq Khan. Sustrans provide really good guidance, but I'm particularly going to talk about the London Cycle Design Standards. So this is a 2014 update of a 2005 document, and it's a huge improvement. So it's all freely available online. It's broken down into chapters. It's really visual, and it gives lots of options for different scenarios that you might have on the road. So for example, how you might route a cycle lane around a bus stop without compromising the functioning of the bus stop. It gives different guidance for how you might divide up the street space. And all of them are illustrated and show you how you might go about implementing it. But I think the next step for London and for the UK might be to start to learn from other countries. So on a strategic level, Paris, if you've been watching it, the Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who's been voted in now for a 2nd term, which is great. She has a vision for the 15-minute city, which came from one of the universities in France. And the idea is that at an urban design scale, you would only be 15 minutes walk or cycle from any of the things that you need regularly in your life, like work or healthcare or grocery shopping or the bakery, which is a really great way of laying out a city and activates all parts of the city, but also allows people to travel by the most economic and healthy means, which is walking and cycling. The Netherlands is always held up as a good example of the design principles for cycling. Their principles are fantastic to go through. So if anyone's interested, email me afterwards and I can send information to you. But the main principle, it's a set called sustainable safety. And it's based on 5 core principles, one of which is illustrated here. So it's that you never mix high differences in speed or in direction or in size. So you can see here that truck is probably going quite fast relative to the speed of the cyclist. It's also much bigger than the cyclist, and they are traveling in different directions. So you would never mix those things. So at the level of this road, which is a motorway, you would always have completely segregated cycleways. Whereas on more like a regional district road, you might share. So the cycleway might be either side of the road. And then in town centres, all traffic might mix, but it's moving really slowly, like at 20 kilometers per hour. So it's a really interesting set of principles. And it's quite conceptual, and then it's evidenced in all of the road design throughout the country. So you know intuitively from the materials that are used, from the street layout, everyone knows how to behave. So it's a really good set of principles. And then also in countries that you might not have expected, we saw during COVID, lots of examples of great infrastructure going in Milan, going in here, Bogota, Colombia. And actually it turns out that Bogota have for many years been promoting cycling. And this is one strategy, which is they have cycling Sundays. So on a Sunday, entire streets in the city centre are given over just to cycling. And people can just be out and play even on the streets, which is a great idea for promoting it and for giving people sort of like a tempting example experience of what it would be like if there were fewer vehicles and more active travel, more human scale of travel infrastructure. And if you are interested in Dutch infrastructure, this website, Dutch Cycling in London, is fantastic. So Saskia is a member of the Construction Industry Cycling Commission. She's originally French, but she spent 5 or 6 years living in the Netherlands. And when she moved to London, she was like, wow, why is it done like this? Like, why didn't they do it the way they did it in the Netherlands? And so she got funding from the Young Urbanistas to make this website. So she's got loads of lovely infographics and just explaining different things, such as how the Dutch train children in how to cycle. So throughout school, alongside your normal lessons, you also have lessons in cycling. And they start off with the basic skills, so everyone has the technique. But then it becomes more nuanced at about the age of 11, where you're expected not only to be able to handle yourself, but also to start to anticipate how other cyclists might use the road, and to take responsibility for that your actions as a cyclist shouldn't make it more dangerous for other people. There's point 3 and 4 are both related to the clock standards. So these are freely available online. And as I explained, they put the onus of responsibility for the safety of, not only the safety of site upon the contractor, but also the safety of vehicles traveling to and from their site upon the contractor. And so that's things like making sure the cab is as safe as possible, the driver is licensed, the driver is well trained, they have maneuvering warnings, they report any issues, any collisions, there's a quality control, and also it looks out for the well-being of the driver to make sure that the driver is in a good fit state to be driving and not rushed, not overscheduled, so that he's likely to cut corners and maybe cause accidents. And so we can write these, so as architects, we need to take care of this when we're carrying out the CDM role, the principal designer role, in terms of site logistics. And then also we have a spec clause that we write into our specification to oblige the contractor to sign up to the clock standards. And it all boils down to this statistic where so little of traffic is made up of HGVs, only 3.5%, but 57% of cycling fatalities are caused by HGVs. So if you can improve that safety, you vastly improve the safety on the roads for cyclists. In terms of HGVs, the Commission has looked a lot at collisions around HGVs, but also the particular most dangerous spots, which, as you might expect, are anywhere where the driver can't see. So if the driver's in his cab, he doesn't have good visibility by the passenger door. He has very poor visibility when the cab is high of people in front of him below, especially over at the passenger side. So you can see 27% of injuries happen there, 21% of fatalities, even 21% of fatalities are happening by the passenger door. The rear of the vehicle is also dangerous, and a lot of this is to do with the high chassis. So in high winds, a cyclist can get blown underneath, or something gets caught and they get dragged underneath, and unfortunately the driver doesn't know, so he doesn't stop on time. So really, really tragic things happening in these situations. And when we looked into it a bit more, we realized that very little has changed in the design of HGVs over the past 50 years. So HGVs were typically designed to go over really rough ground. There's a demolition contractor on the Commission, and he has told us that now 90% of the time his vehicles don't go over rough ground. In fact, he could only have 10% of his fleet with that high chassis if he needed to. But there's never been an impetus for the manufacturers of these vehicles to change their design, except perhaps now with the introduction of low emission zones where they have to anyway change to electric vehicles. Maybe it will prompt, maybe I'm being idealistic, but it'd be great if it prompted a redesign of the vehicles in general. But in the absence of that, the Commission has been looking at how things can be retrofitted, or how, or just affect the cab. So here you can see, this is in the City of London, but you can see a number of safety features. So the sill at the front has been lowered compared to a usual cab in a truck. So now it's a little bit more like a bus actually, but the driver has much better visibility to the front. Then the passenger door is made of glass. So if he looks over, he'll spot a cyclist, or in the side of his peripheral vision, he'll notice if a cyclist is there. And then also you can see the yellow thing between the wheels. That lowers the kind of opening between the wheels. So it's much harder for a cyclist or a pedestrian to get caught under there, or to be blown under by high winds or anything. There are also safety features that involve technology, like cameras in various points of the truck, and alarm sounds. And so while I think they're helpful, they can also be a distraction. So if for cameras in the cab, the driver has like 3 or 4 screens showing different camera views, I think he has a lot to concentrate on, particularly in a busy city. He's trying to concentrate on what's going on. He's trying to navigate. And then he also has to look at all these screens to see that nothing untoward is happening. So in a city where it's not possible to completely segregate large vehicles and cyclists, which would be the ideal, but loads of cities are on a medieval grid like London, and you don't have that space. So you do, in some situations, have to mix them. These kind of features can help in the design. So these are the clocks guidance documents, and also the web link where you can find them. And if anyone's interested, I can send afterwards we put it into the architectural specification into the A section, just a really short piece obliging the contractor to sign up to these and to follow the clocks guidance documents. The Commission also have a set of site hoardings, a design which again I can send to you if you have building sites and contractors who you think would put this up. And it's simply a reminder to everyone around a site that there might be cyclists going by, to look out for them, just to keep it in their mind's eye that you won't only have trucks and cars, you will also have cyclists, so to try to be safe around them. And we have these up in various places, mostly around London, but also in Oxford. And this is the final section, so it's to do with design ambition. I like this example of cycle parking because it works, it's very subtle, but it follows the design language of the rest of the building in the courtyard. And it also creates, if you were locking up your bike, you might meet a neighbor in this courtyard. And equally, the fact that it's in a social space gives it added safety of it being overlooked in terms of passive surveillance. This is an example of a cycle cafe. So in the UK, cycle cafes have become really popular. And to be honest, in the Netherlands, it wasn't a thing because, of course, you can cycle to a cafe and everyone cycles. So why would you have a cafe that's a cycle cafe? But this is one example at a university, in the Technical University of Delft, where they had a huge cycle parking facility and they were trying to activate it. And so they were looking for ideas. And what they did was they integrated a cafe and they also put it on this mound, which allowed people to sit out. So that's that quite nice combination is you arrive on your bike, you can grab a coffee before you go to a lecture, and it activates the whole space. And again, creates that passive surveillance, makes it more social, makes it more, a bit safer. This is an example of a ramp in a building. So as I mentioned, Hawkins Brown are designing a couple of ramps now in buildings in Woking and in London. And this ramp I've cycled, which was quite fun. Some people find the turning point a bit tight, but it is very nice to be able to go straight from the street, right down, cycling down into the cycle parking. And then you just go up and you could, all the showering and changing rooms are down there. Then you can go up in the lift to your office. This is like a co-work space near the City of London. And then this is an example from the Netherlands. This is the largest bike parking facility in the world. I think it houses, I'm not sure if I'm going to get this right, something like 13,000 bike parking spaces. And it operates a little bit like a car park, actually. So you have these big wide ramps everywhere that you can cycle along, and then bays, and the bays are numbered like ABC. So you can always figure out which bay you've put your bike in. It's integrated with the station in Utrecht. So it creates this seamless journey where you park your bike and then you go up into the train, and everything can be done on one card. So you pay for the bike parking and you can pay for your train journey all on the one card, which is, and then usually in the Netherlands, often people will have two bikes, so that if they work in another city, they'll have their bike that they ride to the station in their hometown, and then they'll have another bike at their destination station, which they will ride from that station to their workplace. So it's a really different view of cycling. People won't have expensive bikes. They'll kind of accept, well, some people do, but they'll kind of accept that their bike is going to get stolen at some point. So there's not much point in having a really expensive one. So you'll see them everywhere outside stations, and they might have their nice bike at their home station and a cheap bike at the other end that they just lock outside. This is quite a subtle example that I really like. So this station was designed on desire lines. So they first looked at the site and they looked at where people walk, and then they created buildings and bunches of cycle parking in the places between the desire lines. So they kept all the places where people want to move, and then they put more static things in the residual space. And the cycle parking is slightly recessed into the ground. And the effect of this is it kind of creates its own space for cycle parking. So if you're locking up your bike, you don't feel like you're in someone's way who wants to walk. It discourages pedestrians from kind of walking in through the cycle parking unless they're deliberately taking that shortcut. And then also visually, it's nice because if you're a pedestrian at one side of the cycle parking, you can look over to the other side of the cycle parking without bikes impeding your view. So through a very subtle design technique, it's created a much better urban space. This is another lovely example. So this is a shortcut for cyclists going across the harbour in Copenhagen. It makes the journey shorter, as I said, for cyclists. It's also a really lovely journey because you're going over the water. And it's purely for cyclists, so you don't feel like you're in the way of drivers or pedestrians. So this is a really nice example. I'd love to see more of this in the UK and Ireland. This is quite an ambitious example. This is actually the city where I used to live, Eindhoven. So rather than cyclists having to negotiate this really tricky junction, they've raised up the whole intersection for cyclists up above the road. So you go up and then you kind of go around a roundabout and choose where you need to go down again. And it doesn't always have to be super expensive. So this is an example in Auckland, New Zealand, where they had an extra piece of infrastructure, actually part of the highway that wasn't being used by vehicles, and they decided to convert it into a cycle lane. And they blinged it up with this pink purple color and nice lighting. And now it's become like a destination, where people want to Instagram. So I think that's a pretty good example of, and another example here of where it doesn't have to cost the earth. It's in Portugal. So this is a cycle lane between Lisbon and Belém along the river. And they combined super graphics and poetry, so poetry from one of the most famous poets of Portugal. And it makes it really attractive. It's still quite gritty, but in a nice way. And it also gives this lovely open space dedicated to cycling. This is one of my favorite examples. So it's called the Circle Bridge, and it's at the mouth of a harbour, a little harbour in Copenhagen. So boats still need to pass through here. The bridge is only for pedestrians and cyclists, and in and of itself, it's really lovely. It's lovely how the light falls through it, but also it's clever engineering because little canoes or little boats can go under it, but then for the large ships with masts, the circles like rotate relative to each other to make an opening to allow the ship to pass through, and then they re-rotate to lock back into place and allow people to walk by. And then this example is really nice. Again, this is part of a wider scheme in Belgium. So they have cycled through water and they have cycled through trees. So you might get a bit wet, but it's a good experience. And particularly at sunset or sunrise, how the water reflects is really, really lovely. And that's it. So spread the word. If you have the opportunity, design safe environments for everybody. Try to get cycling provision into the brief. Get contractors to sign up to the clock standards. And if you can, make it fun. So I'll take questions now, but if anyone does want to contact me separately, please feel free to email me at Hawkins Brown and I can respond.
Louise, thank you very much for that. That was excellent. We have some comments. One from Alan Moore. It says, I guess a lot of us watching would like to be able to share this talk with our colleagues, and in my case, local road engineers in County Tipperary. Will the talk be available online? It is so inspiring. Yeah, we're recording the talk, and hopefully it'll be available on the Engineers Ireland website quite soon. We have a comment from Seamus McGeralt, who is picking up Irish engineers. Apparently the bridge in Copenhagen was designed by ROD engineers in Dublin.
Nice.
And the same engineer designed the Auckland one too in his former job.
Ah.
Yeah. A technical question for you from Tom Rowan. He says, "Hi Louise, can you advise us where you consider red asphalt should be used in cycle tracks?"
That's interesting. So in the Netherlands, they use red asphalt for cycle tracks. In London, they chose blue. In some countries, they have it green. And I would say it's the most important is probably to make it coherent, to make a decision. I really like the buff color, which is what they've been using in the new cycle infrastructure in Dunleary in Dublin. And I would say, ideally, if the budget allows, I would put it everywhere where there are cycle tracks on the road to distinguish between the black tarmac for vehicles and the, say, buff cycle lane, on the paths to make it clear which is which, but also a color like buff is like, it's less in your face than blue and it's less in your face than black. So it's a bit calmer and works better with green spaces. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it sounds like it does. We have another question from Anonymous. It says, what are your thoughts on e-scooters using cycle lanes? Do you see any issues with them and how they interact with cyclists?
That's a really good question. And I think it's being debated at the moment because I think legally they might be, they're looking to change it, but actually they're not, poor scooters, they're not legal on the path and they're not legal on the road. So where are they supposed to be? I think they should be allowed to use the cycle lane. I suppose I feel they're a slower moving vehicle. They look really vulnerable on the road when they're mixing with traffic. Maybe they're not vulnerable, but just a person just seems very vulnerable. I think they would be safer on the cycle tracks. In the Netherlands, it's dictated on speed. So scooters traveling at their slower speeds are allowed to use the cycle lane, but motorbikes, which are traveling fast, cannot. And I'd probably go with the same thing, that you could do it on speed. So assuming scooters aren't moving more than like 15, 20 kilometers per hour, I think it's fine. But again, there needs to be a certain amount of education about how people do it. And if, as a scooter person needs to go left, they still need to indicate to the cyclist that I want to go left or right. So I would say yes.
Cool. Connor Whelan asks, he says, hi Louise, thank you for the presentation. What are your thoughts regarding segregation methods between cyclists, cars and cyclist pedestrians? National Cycle Manual here tends towards 50mm high curbs. However, they can tend to be a trip hazard.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of places are just figuring this out, what the best method is. I see different ones being trialed in Dunleary. So in London, we've got kind of what they call the armadillos, the kind of flat, round ones that are intermittent, and wands. And then in Dunleary, I saw one that's more like a wave. I think a curb between the vehicle and the cycleway is a good idea, but I would chamfer it on the cyclist side, because there's a thing called curb shyness, which I'm sure you all know more about than I do, but you won't go that close to a curb. So you want the driver to be a bit shy of the curb, but equally you don't want to narrow the cycle lane too much. So if you were to chamfer the inside edge, it makes it easier for cyclists to use all of the space. But what I would say is, between a path and a cycle lane, those little chamfered curbs are great, because they're not something that you're going to trip over. They're also not something that are going to cause a cyclist to crash, but they do create that subtle segregation.
Cool, thank you. We have a kind of a more detailed design question from Rosalind Carroll. Galway City Council want to put a shared pedestrian and cycle bridge next to Salmon Weir Bridge. There's an elevation change needed over a relatively short distance. The current design uses the max allowable gradient for wheelchairs. Is this acceptable for cyclists? And what surface material would you suggest for the bridge? Are you getting a bit of free design advice?
I would say yes. If it's okay for a wheelchair, it will be okay for cycling. In terms of the surface, I I don't really specify the surfaces, but I would say something that you need it to perform well when it's wet. So it mustn't be too smooth, because then you lose grip when wet. So something with a level of aggregate over it. Without seeing the bridge design, it's a little bit difficult. Like if it's possible to continue an asphalt type surface with, I don't know, the master tint or something above it, that might be suitable. Probably you don't want metal unless you're able to create like a patterning in it. And equally timber can be quite slippy.
Yeah. Cool. We have a comment from Alan Lipscomb. Says, great presentation. When considering rural cycleways at locations where they require, apologies. When considering rural cycleways at locations where they require to cross a regional road with 80 or 100 kilometers per hour speed limit, do you think grade separation is the only solution?
It probably depends a bit on the individual situation, but yes, ideally, like the budget, it probably depends a bit on the budget, but ideally, yeah, you want to have either a tunnel for the cyclists or a bridge over. Tunnels are often perceived as being a bit dangerous, but they do have the advantage for cycling that you go down first, so it's less off-putting than having to go up first, like when you have to go up over a bridge. But yeah, bridges are probably a nicer way to cross over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. And a lot of comments thanking you for your presentation. Eamon Mullally says, excellent presentation. Pat Staunton, very interesting presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
A lot of people enjoying it.
Oh,
I'm struggling now to find another question I can ask. Other general comments are, Seamus McGarrell says, improved truck design is a fantastic idea to reduce risk. And in relation to the hovering, the car parking, apparently Drury Street car park in Dublin has quite a lot of bicycle parking available, but it's nowhere near the 13,000 spaces provided in the Netherlands. How far do you think the UK and Ireland are away from kind of getting to that stage where there's these really fantastic pieces of infrastructure being created solely for cycling?
good question. It seems to, sometimes I feel really hopeful about it, and then sometimes less so. Like, I actually feel there's a better chance for Ireland than there is overall in the UK. I think it's especially encouraging seeing what's happening in Dún Laoghaire with Robert Burns. In the UK, I think, in Ireland, we are quite tied to the car. And I think in rural Ireland, you need a car. Like, it's going to be quite difficult to do a lot of things by bike. But in the UK, it seems to be even more, it's very tied with status. Like, I think one of the biggest problems in the UK and Ireland is attitude, and political will is kind of tied to attitude. So like, things have happened during COVID where the Prime Minister in the UK, he said, we need to make more space for cycling and for walking. And all of the big messages, all the strategic messages are, yeah, we need to do this, we need to do this. And then certain councils applied for the funding. For example, where I live in London is in Barnet. And Barnet Council got some funding for street space for cycle provision and walking. And the Conservative council, because of all the objections they got from residents, decided not to spend the money. So although the overall message is correct, it often doesn't happen on the ground. So I think that's what is going to slow progress in the UK down, whereas it's probably more of a budgetary consideration in Ireland. But maybe there are ways of changing that attitude a bit. Like, so a motorway junction can cost like, I don't know, 30 million, whereas cycle infrastructure is a fraction of that, and yet it can have so many far-reaching impacts. One other thing that kind of holds cycling back is the people who finance newspapers are often to do with gasoline or petrol. And so reporting, this is something that Rachel Aldred of the University of Westminster has done a lot of work on, is the reporting of accidents between cyclists and cars. How it's reported often doesn't lay responsibility on the driver of the car. Like, cars drive into buildings and ruin buildings, and they cause so much damage, but often it's cyclist accident or cyclist and car, but how it's reported, it sounds like it's the cyclist's fault or like the car's fault, not the driver's fault. So I think there's a whole thing that isn't to do with, I think sometimes the technical issues are the easiest to solve. It's the political, getting a handle on the political situation and leading it and making sure that the political ideas get followed through on the ground. And I think because Ireland is a smaller country, that might be more doable, particularly in our cities. And it's really encouraging to see things like in Limerick and Galway, like the school bus, like big groups of, because there's no cycleway, the parents take big groups of children in a whole big bus to school. It's lovely to see. So hopefully eventually those school children will get their cycleways.
Okay, good answer. We have another kind of another wider, less technical question. Vehicle tax contributes to the upkeep and maintenance of roads. If cyclists are to increasingly occupy, hopefully, more road space, do you think cyclists should contribute to the maintenance of these assets in the future?
Well, I don't know. I've been in London 10 years now, so I don't know how it works in Ireland, but I know in the UK, there is actually no such thing as road tax. Road tax got abolished by Winston Churchill in 1937. And so roads are actually, the upkeep of roads in the UK is from general taxation. So even as a cyclist who doesn't own a car, I am paying for the upkeep of the roads. And then the other form of upkeep of the roads is based on the car, like their emissions. So I think there is a slight charge on that. But yeah, I don't know exactly how it works in Ireland, but I suspect general taxation is also funding roads. So I feel that this road tax argument that you often have with, for example, a taxi driver is defunct because everyone pays for roads. And actually the cost of cars being on roads and the pollution caused by them is a far greater cost than cyclists would ever need in order to have cycle infrastructure.
Cool, thank you. And we've another question from Eamon Mullally. What is Louise's thoughts on using shared roads, 30 km/h in urban areas where segregated lanes are difficult to achieve?
I think that's fine. So in the Netherlands, they have three kind of general hierarchy of road. So the first, it's 20 km/h in the Netherlands. But say a city centre, you'll often have kind of cobble lock. So it's a really distinctive surface treatment. And everyone in that area knows they need to travel slowly and watch out for other vehicles and pedestrians. So it's all shared. And then they have various levels of segregation on other road types. So I think that can work fine, as long as it's really clear. And I would prefer to see that made clear in the materials that you're using, rather than in signage and rules. And like, for example, if people drive over cobble lock, it makes a noise, and it's been proven that when you drive over that, you then drive more slowly. than you would on asphalt. So I think it's fine, but it needs to be well designed.
Great. We've got a question from Liam Ryan. He says, should we lead the change to bicycle usage with education first, followed by infrastructure? If we wait for perfection, we may not achieve the critical mass or inertia for this change.
I think it's a good point, like that it needs both. So I think that means it is an iterative process. You don't automatically put in fantastic cycle infrastructure that would cause such political uproar, but a certain amount of infrastructure does need to go in if you're going to get children cycling, for example. And I mean, I think that has got to be one of the big goals, is that a child can cycle to school. And kids in the Netherlands, in all happiness surveys, they're the happiest in the world. And I think a lot of that is down to how much independence they have. And they have that independence because they're trusted to cycle on their own, and their parents know they'll be safe because they have really good infrastructure and they're taught how to use it. So yeah, maybe it's about being strategic, like making some really key infrastructure safe. So maybe prioritizing cycle routes to school so that is safe, and then educating people. But yeah, they definitely have to go in tandem.
Great. Simon Keating says, excellent presentation. Thank you, Louise. And also Leo Dillon says, great webinar. Thanks for organizing. And thank you, Louise. I hope this is the first of many cycling related webinars to be run by Engineers Ireland. We hope so too. And Seamus McGirl says, thanks, Louise, for a great talk. I think we are kind of running out of direct questions. Various comments telling us that there's no road tax in Ireland either. It's motor tax.
Okay.
Just for future reference.
Yeah, good to know.
Brendan Mulligan says, great webinar. Philip Kelly says, thank you, Louise. Very insightful. Sheila Ganane, hopefully I got your name correct, Sheila. Could Louise talk about identifying the best components for a network to start with?
Yeah.
Presumably that's a cycle network.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So I don't know if anyone's read the book Invisible Women, but it's super interesting about how typical city planning, it ranges about all things, but its basic premise is a lot of the world is designed around the needs of men, because typically they have been the people designing. And so sometimes things are being forgotten. So if you look at almost certainly in London, if you looked at the initial how the cycleways were laid out, they were all these radial routes from the suburbs into the city, which is works very well for maybe a typical man in London's life. So he lives in the suburbs, he goes into the city to work, and that's his nice direct cycling route. But if you look at women's traveling patterns, women's patterns are very different. So women do this thing called trip chaining. So often women are taking more caring responsibilities, or so they might drop off at their grand's house, or they might drop children off to school. Men also drop children off to school, so this becomes then more relevant for everyone. Then they might go to the shop, and often if they're not going into the city to work, they're around their local area. So the travel pattern is very different. It's not this radial route. So I think, and also that if you can get children cycling, you have a much greater hope that they will continue cycling later in their life. If you have their parents cycling and their mums cycling, which is often a bigger barrier for women to cycle, they will feel much more comfortable with segregated infrastructure. So I think I'd prioritize local journeys. So like particularly journeys to school, journeys to the local shops, and then later those big radial routes. If you had one from scratch. Yeah, I think the first thing I'd prioritize would be safe routes to school for segregated infrastructure.
Great. Sheila says, thank you, Louise, for that perfect answer. Wow, well done. And also we have Emer Nagel, who says, great to hear Invisible Women mentioned. Brilliant book and must read for any design professional. I think we'll do one more question and then we are going to wrap it up. Rosalind Carroll comes back with a very interesting question. Stakeholders involved in design processes. Should this include local cycle groups or something similar? What is the practice in the UK or other countries? So should local cycle groups be involved in the design process?
Yes, I think that would be great. A lot of things in Holland got moving because of local cycle groups and because of parents. So they also in Holland in the 60s had loads and loads of road infrastructure, and there were a lot of deaths, particularly among children who were cycling. And so the parents got out on the streets in a big protest called Stop the Kindermoord, which is Stop the Children Dying. And it was that impetus from cycling groups, from parents, that campaigned. So it began as a bottom-up movement. And then because the governance in the Netherlands is quite flat, they eventually got to collaborate with the city planners, and it became kind of the whole policy. So then it was working quite well and across the board. In London, there's this group called the London Cycling Campaign. And so they particularly campaign for cycling, and then also Sustrans. But I think that would be brilliant to get cyclists involved, because, and I can understand, like if you've never cycled, it's quite difficult for a transport planner who's never cycled to design cycle infrastructure, because they're just thinking, okay, how do I get them from A to B? But they might miss some opportunities and create difficulties that they don't realize. Like there's a big thing about kissing gates, where you often at entrances to parks, and they're quite difficult to cycle around and impossible if you're a disabled person or on a bike or you have a cargo bike. So those kind of things need to be considered. And if you say a transport planner doesn't cycle, but they make their design and then they put it out and discuss it with a cycling group, those cyclists will tell them immediately, oh no, that won't work, you could do this. So yeah, I think that's a great idea to involve people.
Great. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you, Louise, very much for taking the time to talk to us today. Excellent presentation. Sinead Glavin says, super talk, Louise. Philip Gray says, excellent presentation, and the plaudits go on.
Thank you.
If anybody wants to contact Louise, it's Louise Moriarty